They were all American girlfriends, but what happened? It's your fault. They were all American girlfriends, but they all brought their own cars. And they all had, you know, Rolls Royces, and Mercedes-Benz, and all kinds of strange things. One of them had a driver. And I'm thinking, geez, man, come on. You've got a driver, and actually the driver played for us, and he was better than the three of them. That was kind of interesting. Anyway, Saudi Arabians, very, very wealthy people, but they're mean. They're kind of mean, and here lately we've had problems with Saudi Arabia in that they executed a newspaperman, a reporter, who was working for the United States, or for the Washington Post in the U.S., but he was Saudi Arabian. And of course, they felt like they could punish him, they could do whatever they wanted, so they executed him. He went into the embassy and they killed him and chopped him up. Revenge. He had said negative things about the royal family, as interesting as that is. So they have elections in Saudi Arabia. What kind of elections do you think they have? Free elections? As it turns out, it's just the royal family that gets to vote. But the royal family is huge. It has like 2,000 to 5,000 people in it, depending on how deep you go into their little princelings. So there's a lot of people in the royal family, but he said something negative about the royal family, and the next thing you know, he's chopped into hamburger. I know, we still don't know where he is, but we know he's dead. They've admitted that they killed him. And the fourth group was the Russians, were the fourth group. So there's a ton of stuff going on about the Russians. They obviously, they did interfere with our last election. Maybe they interfered with this election. We're not exactly sure. We haven't heard yet. They tried to keep them from hacking into our electoral system this time, since we knew they were out there. And they indicted a couple people, a couple of Russians, in Russia, of course. They were in Russia. They were doing this through the internet. But they indicted a couple of people over the last couple months who were from Russia and who evidently were hacking into our electoral system again. So this is kind of a problem because we've got a president that likes their president. So this is kind of a weird situation. He says that he can talk to Putin. Of course, you saw his last summer. I'm sure you were aware that they had a press conference together, and they had a summit just between the two of them. As it turned out, there weren't any other Americans in the room. There was just a translator. So there were 2 Americans and 2 Russians in the room. And this was where was this? Where did they have that? It was Finland, wasn't it? Wasn't it Reykjavik? I can't remember where they went. Anyway, wherever they went, it was probably bugged. So, I don't know, maybe we bugged it too, but I'm not sure. I'm guessing not. He seems to really like the Russians. In 2011, he took his Miss World contest over to Moscow, and it was in Moscow. Trump used to own the Miss World competition. I don't think he does anymore. But so he took the thing over to Russia. So they were wining and dining. Wine. He doesn't drink wine. He doesn't drink. And dining and doing other things for Mr. Trump. He wasn't President Trump at the time. So the question is, can we trust the Russians? Well, obviously we can't if they hacked into our last election and potentially, and we know that they tried to hack into this election. So what do we know about the Russians? What should we understand about the Russians? Is their culture that much different than ours is? Or should we assume they're just like us? Come on, most of the people in the United States are white, most Russians are white. Aren't all white people the same? Isn't that what we just said? All the Europeans are exactly alike? Well, there are half of them. The white people in Russia are European. They live in the European section of that, Asia and Europe are stuck together right there, and that's Russia. Russia's right there. So are they the same as us? Trump's doesn't speak Russian. He's been to Russia a couple times. So does he understand the Russians better than our diplomats do? Better than the State Department does? Can we trust them? Can he trust what Putin tells him? What did Putin tell him? Putin told him that they didn't have anything to do with the election, the 2016 election. Putin said that, and he believed him, even though his own security services, all of them, all 13 of them, were saying that the Russians interfered with our election. Putin said no, and so Trump decided he'd believe Putin over 13 agencies, NSA, DEA, all the rest of them, CIA, FBI, all those guys, all those fun guys, Homeland Security, military intelligence. So what do you guys think? Are the Russians different than we are? Remember, we're the ones that came in last in this game. These guys, that was very rare for us to do. But these guys, they were fourth. They had the fourth highest level of revenge on the individual that theoretically did something, or somebody that didn't do anything. So what do you guys think? I mean, I've studied international relations, and I've never been in Russia, but I've been to Europe, and I faced off the Russian tanks in 1980. Yeah, if I had anything to do with that. They turned around and scurried away when they saw me. That's that. Russians invaded Afghanistan in 1980. We were in Germany at the time. Looked like and Carter said, you better pull out of Afghanistan. Of course, the Russians didn't do what Carter said. So it looked like we might be going to war. Of course, we didn't go to war. Instead, they came to our Olympics in Lake Placid, New York, and we beat their hockey team. And then we didn't go to the Summer Olympics, which were in Moscow. We didn't go. The United States didn't go. So, what do you think? Are they good guys or bad guys, or are all white people the same?
Seems like a round of a good card game, everybody folds, everybody wins, just spinning.
Okay.
The pot is probably like domination, whatever, economics or leadership.
Are they good guys? Can Trump trust them? Should Trump trust them? He seems to.
You say that he did like a lot of economic stuff with the Russians, so he probably knows that part of it, about politics and stuff. It's probably unraveling, but he probably won't be, like, by the time he knows, it's too late to even.
Does he care?
Back out. I don't think it's.
Or is money all that he cares about?
3 generations of money, yeah, I think
Well, this is a problem because it was the Russian military that hacked into our last election. We indicted 12 members of the Russian military who hacked into our last election. So it's their military.
What did they do exactly?
What did they do?
Yeah, with the hacking. Yeah.
Oh, they're the ones that stole the DNC, the Democratic National Committee's emails. They're the ones that stole the emails.
Very confidential emails.
Yeah, from Podesta. Remember, Podesta was in charge of Hillary Clinton's campaign, and they hacked into his emails from the DNC. They also hacked the DNC, but they stole all of Podesta's emails, and then they started pumping these things, or they gave them to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks disclosed all this information and made Hillary look really goofy because she was saying, what the hell's going on? She was swearing and stuff. Just like, well, maybe you don't swear on your emails, but I use bad words from time to time. Usually when I'm a little pissed off. I need to be more careful in the future. The Russians may be hacking my stuff. They also hacked, or they set up websites in the United States who bought Facebook advertisement, and then they advertised in favor of Trump.
Well, that's why Trump likes him.
Okay. Can he trust them is the question. Should we trust them, or should we be pissed off
We
that
did
he
you
trusts
that
them?
favor, that's probably what they think. We did you that favor, so you owe us.
And we won't admit it so that you can keep your presidency. I don't know. We'll see what happens. But I've got more information about the Russians. It's not good information, and this is I have to disclose the fact that I was in the Cold War. I was in a shooting war, so I've been shot at by communists, by Russian proxies. So I'm not real positive about the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, the new Russia. They're not my friends. Like I said, I faced off Russian tanks. I said it again. When I was in Germany, there were Russian tanks right on the border. They were ready to sweep in and wipe out West Germany. They were kind of interesting. I drove through the Autobahn corridor between West Germany and West Berlin, which you have to go through East Germany to do that. And when I did that, I had to stop at the checkpoints and salute the Russian soldiers, give them all my paperwork. Half my paperwork was in Russian and the other half was in English, of course. And it was also in French, French and Italian. Because, of course, the West Germany was controlled by all the Allies, which didn't include the Italians. I'm sorry, it wasn't in the Italian army. It was just French and English and Russian, because the Russians are the bad guys, or the bad guys at the time. Anyway, so that's a fair disclosure there. So I don't like the Russians a whole lot. I may look at them a little bit more jaundiced. Maybe Trump is right, and maybe I'm wrong. Maybe the security services were wrong. Maybe they look at Russia with a jaundiced eye, as I do. The notion that punishment promotes cooperation holds true only in societies characterized by norms for civic cooperation and high levels of trust. So that's the only time punishment works. If it's a society where there's very little trust, then punishment doesn't work at all. Because they're used to being punished. They're used to being yelled at. So if you attended school and you had a teacher that shook their finger in your face all the time and made you stand in the corner all the time, the probability that worked, 0. But if it was a teacher that very rarely punished anybody, and when you punish someone, it was a rarity, then probably the punishment worked. So we can use this in our current lives. Antisocial punishment was entirely unexpected by the researchers who first discovered it, but it appears to be quite commonplace in many cultures, and it remains somewhat puzzling. Antisocial punishment. And this is what was going on with the Russians, with the Omanis, with the Greeks, and with the Saudi Arabians. It was antisocial punishment. They were punishing just for punishment's sake. It was revenge punishment. The researchers' data shows that societies with weaker norms for civic cooperation and a weaker rule of law engaged in more antisocial punishment in public goods games. Something happened last week. If you remember, what did Trump say? I keep picking on Donald Trump. What did Trump say? Trump said that remember those immigrants, those Central American immigrants that are coming on that caravan, if they throw rocks at our soldiers, he gave the soldiers the right to shoot back. Rocks versus bullets. What do you think? Makes sense, doesn't it? If somebody's going to hit me with a rock, I'm going to shoot him right in the head. And that's what should happen. Once upon a time in 1970, there was an anti-war rally in Kent State, Ohio. Kent State is a university in Ohio. They were throwing bags of dog food at the soldiers, at the National Guard. These National Guard had just come from a riot in New York City, an anti-war riot in New York City. So they were pretty damn tired. They were the Ohio National Guard. What the hell were they doing in New York, you may ask? Exactly. So what do you do if somebody throws dog food at you? They deserve to die, don't they? Okay. Even if you hit the wrong one, who the hell cares as long as you hit somebody, right? They killed 4 and they wounded 7. They opened fire on the demonstrators, and they killed 4 and wounded 7. Why is that important? It kind of ended the war in Vietnam. Because, I mean, if our kids were dying in the streets, then maybe, and they were demonstrating against the war, maybe they had a point. That was the idea. So, time out, what? You're going to cut off somebody's head. What? What? This means time out. Okay, all right. I was just curious. Okay, so what happened last week? So last week, Trump says, if they throw rocks at us, I'm going to give them the right to shoot back. That's what he said. And you may agree with that. If somebody throws a rock at me, then I'm going to shoot. What happened yesterday? I went into a bar. Sounds like a beginning of a joke. Ventura, California, and killed 12. Shot 12 people, wounded 17. So I'm guessing he reloaded his gun. I mean, I guess you could. But it was a Glock 45. It was a 45 caliber Glock. Anyway, so he killed 12 people. Why am I talking about this? Oh, we're talking about the rocks. Okay, so that's what Trump said one day. The next day, in Nigeria, they were demonstrating. There were people that were demonstrating against the government, and they opened fire because they were throwing rocks at them. And as a defense, the government played Trump's tape. It said, if they throw rocks, I'm going to give them the right to shoot back. So his words had that much power. The Nigerian government used it as the excuse for shooting demonstrators. And actually they killed 12 demonstrators. So where there is weaker rule of law, antisocial punishment is very common, is relatively common. And of course, Nigeria has a relatively repressive government. Other researchers argue that antisocial punishment can be adaptive in contexts where the rule of law is insufficient, and of course that would fit Nigeria. Did the Nigerian army break any laws? No. They had every right in the world by Nigerian law to open fire on the unarmed demonstrators, just like they did at Kent State. Okay. They have no idea who did the killing, by the way, at Kent State. In dealing with a system that can't always be trusted to function, people come up with alternative ways to ensure that their needs are met. In Brazil, there is a complex socio-cultural strategy termed jatimbo, by which people manipulate or dodge the official rules to achieve things. Do we ever do that in the United States? Do we ever dodge the official rules to achieve our ends? Do we do that? Anybody drive up from Gallup today? Or drive? Where'd you come from? Lukachukai? Did you go 55 miles an hour like a good girl?
No, I got pulled over just once.
You did?
Yes.
Where were you driving? I haven't seen any cops here for months.
From Rock Point.
Rock Point?
Yes.
And it was a Navajo police?
No.
No.
I don't think I'm employees.
No, they don't pull anybody over fast by.
Yeah, they drive as fast as we do.
Of course they do.
Probably faster.
the only warning they give is the lights.
So it was a cop.
Yeah.
Cop pulled you over. Okay. Were you going too fast? Were they right?
He said my headlights was out.
Oh. Is this a driving while brown situation? Is that why he stopped you? Could he tell that you were, is your car dark inside? Can they not see through the windows? Was he able to identify you as a neighbor? Well, how did he do that? He can't see inside the car. How could he identify you? It doesn't say on the outside of your car that you're a native. Does it? You have a Dene College sticker on the back of your car? Okay. So how fast?
Then he asked me about the president who won.
And what did you say? I'm just curious.
Yeah. He just said, so who won the election last night? Wait, the other day. Nez and Lizer.
Oh, he's talking about the Navajo.
Navajo.
Okay. So Nez won, didn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
He said, oh, I knew him ever since he was a
So he
child."
didn't give you a ticket?
He gave me a
warning.
warning
Okay.
to get my headlights fixed.
Okay. You're driving during the day and okay. And your headlight was out. Okay. Doesn't make any sense to me. Maybe it made sense to him.
Probably.
Does anybody watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? I think it's off the television now.
Yeah, I think they just do like replay or like rerun the ones from the past.
But we get to see it.
Yeah.
It's a lot of fun.
I like the.
All the interesting things.
Slumdog Millionaire is probably better than the American.
A real-life example of these weaker norms for civic cooperation can be seen in the game show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. In the show, which was originally created in the United Kingdom, the Brits created it. Contestants are able to use a lifeline and can poll the studio audience for help in answering a difficult question. So in essence, you can get answers for 2 questions. Well, it took like 8 to get $1 million or something like that, right? 8 questions. You had to answer 8 questions correctly. More than that?
More than that.
But you get 2 for free. You can poll the audience or you can call a friend or something. Isn't that what it was? You can call a friend on the
Did
telephone.
they have that 50-50?
There's a 50-50 one? Oh, where they take out, there's 3
They take out
50-50s.
2 wrong answers and they leave one true and 1 wrong.
Okay.
Yeah,
So-
watch it a lot.
So there were 3 of them. There were 3 50-50s. Okay.
And there was 3.
Okay, the United States and the United Kingdom were not the only places where they had this television show. They had a form of it in Russia. When Who Wants to Be a Millionaire was introduced in Russia, the contestants quickly found out that they couldn't trust the audience. Frequently, the audience members would deliberately choose the wrong answer in an apparent effort to mislead the contestants. Isn't that the meanest thing you've ever heard? Horrible is that.
Good idea, Mr. Sharp. Good idea, Bruce.
Only the Russians would do it. As confusing as that is, so their culture is a lot different from ours. Now, why in the world would the Russians have a different culture from other Europeans? I mean, it doesn't work that way in England. It doesn't work that way in the United States. Most of the white people in the United States are not from England, by the way. Most of them are from Germany. We have more German immigrants in the United States than any other group. England is way down the list. They're like 5th or 6th. A lot of Irish. A lot of Scandinavians, Norwegians and Swedish. Swedish.
Did you say that the majority of them are Germans?
German, yeah, the most people.
Doesn't that go back to Schadenfreude?
Schadenfreude. Schadenfreude. Now that's really interesting that you mentioned that, because what happened yesterday? So we know what happened in the election. The Democrats took over the House. So it was kind of a victory for the Democrats. But of course, at the news conference yesterday, what was the first thing that Trump did?
He they done?
He jumped all over the Republicans that lost. And one of the guys said, it's like he's dancing on their graves. What a horrible thing to do. And I was thinking when I read that and when I saw the clip of him making fun of the Republicans that lost, I was thinking, Trump, his name is German, isn't it? And he's only been here for 3 generations. That's schadenfreude. Making fun of people that something horrible happened to them. It's schadenfreude. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I was going to talk about that, and I forgot. Of course, I forgot. But it's schadenfreude. He's making fun of his own party, and then he got all pissed off at one of the newspapermen, Jim Acosta from CNN, and took away his press credentials. He's been a reporter, a White House reporter for 5 years, and now he just pulled his press credentials. So the Russians are kind of mean. The Germans are mean. We knew that before. The Germans are mean. I mean, they tried to exterminate the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals. But one of the things that they were able to do, and somebody wrote this in one of their discussions, one of the things that they were able to do, they were able to get rid of all of the people that had a defect. So if they had a genetic defect, if they were dwarves, they killed them. If they had an intellectual deficit, they killed them. They exterminated them. So Germany today doesn't have the same genetic flaws that they had before the war. We saw a lot of this. If you've ever seen the movie Freaks, it's about circus freaks that band together, of course. But most of these guys, most of those individuals were from Germany. Now, one of the reasons that we even think about dwarves and gnomes and whatnot, I mean the little statues, actually there were a lot of individuals that had that genetic flaw in Germany. They disappeared. They're no longer there. But there were a lot of individuals, and of course, I'm talking about the gnomes that you see in people's gardens, and they're very popular in Europe. But of course, the Germans actually had a lot of individuals that were dwarves, and that's one of the reasons why the Grimm brothers wrote the stories about the 7 dwarves. I know, Snow White and the 7 dwarves. Okay, because it's Germany. And of course, Tolkien wrote his trilogy during World War II. And of course, there were a lot of dwarves that lived in Germany prior to World War II. There weren't any afterwards, but there were a lot before. So they took out all the genetic flaws, as curious as that is, the Germans. Not unlike the public goods game, many members of the Russian audience seem to be more motivated to sabotage the play of the contestants than to help them. And of course, this wouldn't happen in the United States. As a matter of fact, when we watch some of these games, like Survivor, Survivor is kind of popular in the United States. Survivor is a game from Holland. It started in Holland. And they thought that was just the funniest thing in the world, where somebody would undercut somebody or get everybody to vote against them. They thought that was the funniest thing in the world. It's not really American, but there are Americans that like to watch the television show. But originally it's from Holland. It's from the Netherlands. So sabotaging people is a way that they do things in other parts of the world, but not especially in the United States. As the Brathman 2009 brothers have said, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians became suspicious of those who were trying to profit off the hard work of others. And so they don't trust people like we do in the United States. I'm going to show you a picture. This is not I'm not the one that came up with this name. This is a member of a group, of a singing group in Russia, and they're called Pussy Riot. That's the name of the band. And so why in the world would they name themselves something so... Why would they name themselves that? They're a protest group, a protest band. I got some more pictures of them. There they are. For the longest time, nobody had a clue who they were. They would do performance. They would go out and they would have like a 2-minute concert, and it would be videotaped, and then it would go on YouTube, and then everybody got to watch it, and they got to listen to the music. Of course, they were singing in Russian, and nobody in the well, we could, of course, we could translate. And so what they were singing against Putin and some of the things that Putin had done at that point. 2011 they started, and of course they gave themselves an obnoxious name just to slap the faces of the not the intelligentsia, but the ruling classes in Russia. And that's why they named themselves what they named themselves. It's an all-female group. This is a concert that they gave. As you can see, this is St. Basil's Cathedral behind them, so it's in Red Square. They're about about 3 minutes after this happened, after they took the pictures, they were tear gassed, and they were gassed with somebody threw colored smoke in and amongst them with the tear gas to drive them away, and so people couldn't see them anymore, to stop the video from happening. And you can see how many people there are. And usually their concerts are packed, and the reason, and they only last for 2 or 3 minutes, but the reason that they're packed is because they advertise on social media. So they get all the cool people will come out to their concerts and stuff. This is during the World Cup. The World Cup was in Moscow last year. In the second half, they stormed the field in policemen's uniforms, and they stopped play. And of course, they were trying to make a statement. So that's one of them. That's Blondie right there. That's her name. And as you can see, they wear balaclavas. They wear the face masks, so nobody could tell who they were. And of course, that worked. They wear very bright clothes, which is something that nobody does in Russia. Nobody wears bright clothes in Russia. You don't want to stand out in Russia. Otherwise, you'll get arrested. Anyway, norms for civic cooperation remain relatively low in Russia and many other societies around the world, which makes it more difficult for governments to band citizens together in cooperative ventures. And of course, that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to band the citizens together. She was imprisoned for obscenity for 15 years. This is one of the members of Pussy Riot. And of course, they've been to the United States. They were in a Game of Thrones episode, evidently. No, I don't watch Game of Thrones. Anyway, they were also in an episode of, what was that show? House of Cards. House of Cards. The one in the United States, not the one in England. Anyway, Pussy Riot. Interesting group. Okay. I'm not the one that came up with the name. I swear. But it has to do with protest. And I thought that was kind of interesting. In the Soviet Union, or not the Soviet, I'm sorry, in Russia. There, it's not the Soviet Union. There we go. Chapter 13 is about health. We're going to talk about differences in the health due to cultures. Genetic variability in humans is considerably less than in many other species, given how recently modern humans emerged as a species. We emerged as a species probably 2 million years ago. I was reading about the dinosaurs this morning, and they were talking about 250 million years ago, there were dinosaurs ruled the earth, that kind of thing. Crocodiles still exist from the Jurassic period, stuff like that. Rhinoceri were around at that point as well. But humans, of course, have only been around for a couple million years. So the reality is that despite the fact that you and I are different, and very much different, our genes are very, very similar. If we take every human on Earth and we looked at their DNA, the difference between the one human and the human with the most different DNA would only be about 1.6%. 1.6%. So we're all very, very similar. DNA structure is very, very similar. Which is not bad if you need a kidney, because potentially my DNA matches will be close enough to your DNA that I can give you a kidney, or vice versa. You can give me a kidney. Actually, I don't have very good kidneys, so it would probably be you giving me a kidney. But then again, I'm so old, they probably wouldn't give me a kidney, so I'm kind of SOL. Huh. Damn. This is getting depressing. Edison, give me a kidney if I need one. How many you got? 4? Okay, there we go. Then we're good to go. So what's going on? Modern humans first emerged approximately 200,000 years ago. That's Homo sapiens sapien. We've been around for about 2 million years, but about 200,000 years ago, the first Homo sapiens sapien appeared. Now, along with Homo sapiens sapien came Neanderthal man. Where did Homo sapiens sapien come from? He came from Homo sapiens. So we've been around for about 200,000 years. In the beginning, of course, life for humans started in Africa, and they didn't move out of Africa until, well, about 50 to 60,000 years ago. What did they find? Oh, they found a footprint that is 30,000 years old in Utah. I know. So this gets really confusing. They're trying to figure out when humans first came to the Americas. And they said, whoa, we found the, what is it, that point, that spearhead. What am I thinking of? What's the point? It's a certain type of, I'll tell you later. Okay. They found a certain type of spear point about that was 16,000 years old. So they assumed that no humans had been here, until 16,000 years ago, because that's the first spear point that they ever found, or that's the oldest spear point that they found. But now they found a 30,000-year-old footprint, which has to be human. It looks very human, right? So unless, obviously, humans have been here for a lot longer than 16,000 years. Okay, so it was about 50 to 60,000 years ago that some Homo sapiens sapiens left the African continent. If we look at, and I've said this before, if we look at the DNA of Neanderthals and we look at the DNA of all the humans on Earth, we all have Neanderthal DNA except the people that are still living in Africa, the people that have never left Africa. They don't have any Neanderthal DNA, but I've got it and you guys have got it. We have a Neanderthal marker in our blood, which means that if you left Africa, then at some point we were still the same group. Potentially we were still the same group, despite the fact that you guys came over here, my people stayed in Europe, we still had that Neanderthal marker. Humans have become so dependent on cultural information to survive that culture has become a selective force on the biological nature. On their biological nature. Humans are said to be a product of culture, gene evolution, as they have both evolved biological predispositions to depend on cultural information, and this cultural information enhances their fitness as it continues to evolve. Okay, so some people consumed a lot of milk, lactose, and some people didn't. So some people have lactose intolerance, and some people don't. People that stayed in, or the individuals that stayed in Europe, most of those guys, they're not lactose intolerant. You can find one from time to time, so they're not lactose intolerant. But people on the Japanese island, the islands of Japan. Those individuals never drank milk, ever drank milk. And to this day, if you go to Japan and try to feed them ice cream, they'll fart you out of the room. They are lactose intolerant. They're really lactose intolerant. Almost to a person, the Japanese. Chinese are the same way. They didn't eat milk. They didn't consume milk. So that wasn't something that they evolved doing. So culturally, they didn't eat milk, and they still don't. So if you go to Japan, one of the foods that they will feed you is, well, they'll feed you noodles maybe if you're lucky, and rice, of course. But probably it will be some kind of seafood. Something that comes out of the ocean. And maybe it'll be raw. That's okay. They eat that stuff. They dry squid and eat and chew it like it's chewing gum. Oh my God. Can you imagine what their breath smells like? Have you ever chewed on squid? Or octopus, dried octopus. So while we were in Japan, one of the things we did was we bought, my brother-in-law is a nut. He'll eat anything. I mean, literally, he'll eat anything. One time I saw him eat a carpenter's end. And he was just showing off. Of course, he was just showing off, but he put the damn thing in his mouth and it bit his tongue. I thought that was funny. And then he bit down on it, didn't kill it.
Wait, what was it?
It was a carpenter's ant. It was a big black ant, not this big. And I was just being stupid. Anyway, it bit his tongue twice. I thought that was the funny part. That was the best part. Anyway, so some people are lactose intolerant and some people aren't. A lot of American Indians are lactose intolerant. I have no idea whether you guys are or not, but when I was up in Montana, those guys were. They didn't drink milk. They didn't evolve drinking milk, and the reason they didn't drink milk was because they ate a lot of red meat, and they didn't need the milk. So after they were weaned, they didn't eat any more milk, or they didn't drink any more milk, and they didn't eat dairy products. They never put cheese on their cheeseburgers. Hence, it was just a hamburger, okay? So, my wife doesn't eat cheese on her hamburgers. I don't know if there's something wrong with her too. I eat cheese. I always eat cheese on my hamburgers. Common domain in which we see evidence for this selection is cultural differences in dietary practices such as milk consumption, which I was just talking about. Different cultures vary in what they regularly eat, and long-term persistent changes in dietary practices have been accompanied by genetic evolution that maximizes the effectiveness of the nutrition that people derive from their diets. Remember when I was talking about the Maasai, and of course we were talking about their marriage practices. But the reality is the Maasai they drink milk. They drink a lot of milk. But they don't just drink milk, they mix it with the blood of the cow at the same time. They slit their jugular vein. They don't kill them, they just nick it so that they get, and then they drip, it looks pink. Pink milk, that sounds delightful, doesn't it? I think it's Nestle's. It's just that Nestle strawberry stuff. Strawberry quick. Anyway, some people are lactose intolerant because they didn't evolve eating milk. One of the problems that they had when they started trying to feed American Indians, they made these treaties and they said, oh, we're going to put you on the reservation, don't worry about hunting because we're going to feed you. And so they tried to. That's what they did. So instead of giving you buffalo or venison, deer or elk meat, what they did, they gave you beef. Well, the difference between beef and buffalo is a lot. There's a ton difference between the two. One has a lot of fat in it, and the other has almost none. So the buffalo was very lean meat. So American Indians evolved eating a lot of very rich meat, very fine meat. Didn't have hardly any fat in it at all. So they started feeding you beef, and of course beef doesn't have hardly any fat in it, or has tons and tons of fat in it, compared to buffalo, of course. And then they also tried to feed you things like oatmeal. So they tell the story up north about the first time the people went to Fort Belknap to get their Fort Belknap was actually a fort, and it was actually a commodities fort where they distributed foodstuffs. So the first time they went out there, they gave them all this stuff, and it was all this really good food. You know, lard. They gave them lard to cook their food in. They gave them oatmeal. They gave them a cow, and of course the males wanted to kill the cow, and so they did. But they didn't want to just kill it. They wanted to hunt it. So they let them go, and then they chase them, and then they kill them like a buffalo. You know, they kill them like a buffalo. And so everybody was happy because they killed the cow in the right manner. And they butchered the cow. Everybody was happy. Everybody was happy. As long as everybody was happy. And then they started eating the meat, and they were going, oh, this isn't very good meat. And they took all this oatmeal. Of course, nobody had ever seen oatmeal before. So when they were taking it home, they couldn't figure out what to do with it. So they just threw it out. And so as people were driving back from Fort Belknap to the other end of the reservation, there were all this oatmeal was along the road. And as soon as it rained, of course, it turned into a mess, as you can imagine. Anyway, okay. So some people, and that's one of the reasons why diabetes is so prevalent here, because the food that the Westerners were eating had a lot of starch in it. It had a lot of fat in it that individuals weren't used to. So once they started eating the fatty foods and the starchy foods, they started gaining more weight. Because you were used to hunting, you started, you had been in a situation that was a feast and famine situation. So when you could hunt and when hunting was plentiful, you ate very well, and other times you didn't eat very well. So you were in a feast and famine situation. In which case you maintained all your body fat around your waist, which makes a lot of sense. That's the place to do it. Humans vary in the amount of starch that they eat. In general, people in agricultural societies consume more starch than those in most foraging societies. So then they opened the boarding school. What did they try to teach everybody to do? What did they try to teach the males to do in boarding school? So they were trying to make you guys into farmers, just like, everybody back east. So they were trying to make American Indians into farmers. They wanted you to eat the same food that they ate. They wanted you to grow the same food that they did. Of course, you grow corn, they grow corn. You grow beans, they grew beans. So they figured, what the hell? We'll just make you guys into farmers, and we'll make everybody into a farming community. Now, there were some tribes that were farmers. Not all tribes were buffalo hunters or foragers. Some of them led relatively sedentary lives, and they grew huge fields of corn, or they grew huge fields of beans and squash. If we look at the plains, we can look at the Hidatsa. Who are those other guys over there? There's another, the Arikara. They lived in the same place all year long. They didn't hunt, well, they did hunt buffalo, but half the time they traded for buffalo meat. They traded foodstuffs for buffalo meat. So they traded corn for buffalo. And of course, if you can't just live off buffalo, you also need some vegetative material to eat as well. So there were select tribes that were sedentary. One of them were the Ho-Chunk. You remember those guys, the one that Sharice Davids is a member of. Sharice Davids from Kansas, who just was elected to Congress. She was a Ho-Chunk. People from cultures in which a lot of starch has traditionally been consumed are more likely to have a genetic mutation that increases the amount of amylase protein in their saliva, which helps to digest starch. So if you didn't have a lot of starch in your diet, then you didn't have this amylase. So if you ate that stuff, guess what it did to your stomach? That starch. Well, you couldn't get rid of it because you couldn't digest it and you couldn't use it as food, which was a problem. I couldn't figure out what you guys are reporting now. Okay. In West Africa, populations of Kwa-speaking farmers started to grow yam crops, which required them to clear the forest. This is in Africa. One inadvertent side effect of this cultural practice was that it increased the amount of standing water after a rain, creating a better habitat for malaria-carrying mosquitoes. Before that, they didn't have a problem with malaria. Now all of a sudden, they wanted to become farmers. So they cleared a lot of land, and they created all of these fields. In the fields, of course, they needed to water. There was a lot of water that accumulated in the fields, and because of that, they grew a lot of mosquitoes with their yams. Malaria then spread in these regions and led to the evolution of a particular genetic variant for hemoglobin, which is associated with sickle cell anemia, which has the benefit of making one more resistant to developing malaria. If you've ever been around African Americans, one of the fears of African Americans is that they will have sickle cell anemia. So if you have somebody with the sickle cell trait and they marry somebody with the sickle cell trait, they will produce four children. One of them won't have the sickle cell trait at all. One of them will have sickle cell anemia. And there will be 2 people that have the sickle cell trait, which means that they will not contract sickle cell malaria from the mosquitoes. So you have one child that will contract malaria, they're dead. You have one child with sickle cell anemia, they're dead. But you have 2 children with just the sickle cell trait, and they are immune to malaria, and they will survive. So you have 4 children, 2 of them die and 2 of them survive. That's what happened. And they developed this sickle cell trait, and the sickle cell trait was needed in order for them to not contract malaria, as exciting as that is. So if you have any friends who are African American, potentially, of course, they have a sickle cell trait. In the United States, we don't have to worry about it because we don't have any malaria. But when we went to areas where they did have malaria, like Vietnam, some of those guys didn't have to worry about it because they had the sickle cell trait. And of course, but that means that there's always that one guy that doesn't have, and of course not everybody had the sickle cell trait. So potentially, 2 African Americans who reproduce, potentially neither of them had the trait. So they were susceptible to malaria. However, in this portion of Africa, this was very common. This is sub-Saharan Africa. This is the rainforest. Why don't we stop right here and we'll pick this up next time, as exciting as that is. I only have 2 more chapters to go, so